There are names that echo through time, not as monuments to greatness, but as warnings carved into the memory of the world. Some lives begin softly, wrapped in the ordinary rhythms of childhood, and then twist through shadows until they become unrecognizable, even to themselves. This is the story of a boy who once dreamed of art and beauty, who walked quiet streets and imagined himself painting cathedrals, only to fall so far from that innocence that his name would become synonymous with darkness. It is not a story of heroism, but of tragedy in its truest form, the tragedy of a soul lost to its own demons, dragging millions into an abyss from which there could be no return. Tonight, we journey not to glorify, but to understand how a human being, born into this world like any other, became the architect of history's deepest nightmare. Let the night hold you gently as we walk through this haunting tale, seeking not answers, but perhaps a whisper of caution for all the tomorrows yet to come. If these words carry you closer to sleep, let this channel stay by your side too. Rest your mind here, where history breathes softly and the night wraps around every story like a familiar blanket. Subscribe, and let us walk together through the quiet corners of the past, one gentle evening at a time. The town of Braunau am Main rested quietly on the border between Austria and Germany, a place where two worlds met but rarely troubled one another. The river moved slowly through the center of it all, reflecting the sky and the stone buildings that lined its banks, unchanged for generations. It was April 20, 1889, and in a modest inn on the Vorstadt, a boy was born. His first cries echoed through rooms that had hosted travelers and locals alike, rooms that knew nothing of the weight this single life would one day carry. His mother held him close, her face soft with exhaustion and wonder, while his father stood apart, stern and formal, a man who measured the world in duty and discipline. They named him Adolf, a name that meant noble wolf, though there was nothing in that moment to suggest the savage hunger that name would one day embody. Childhood in Braunau was simple, stitched together from the rhythms of small-town life. Cobblestone streets wound between buildings that had stood for centuries, and church bells marked the hours like a heartbeat. The boy grew in the shadow of his father's authority, a customs official who believed in order above all things, who saw softness as weakness and obedience as virtue. Adolf Hitler was not a cruel man by the standards of his time, but he was distant, demanding, a presence that loomed rather than comforted. And so the boy learned early to navigate the space between expectation and rebellion, between the harshness of his father's world and the warmth of his mother's love. Clara, his mother, was everything Alois was not. She was gentle, devoted, endlessly patient. She had already buried 3 children before Adolf, small graves that haunted her quietly, and so she held this surviving son with a tenderness that bordered on desperation. She sang to him, told him stories, wrapped him in a cocoon of affection that made him feel, for a time, that he was the center of the universe. In her eyes, he was special, marked for something greater, and he believed her because children always believe their mothers. It was a love that would shape him in ways both beautiful and terrible, giving him a sense of destiny but also an inability to accept a world that did not see him as she did. The family moved often, restless in the way that lives touched by discontent always are. From Braunau to Passau, then Lambach, then Leonding, each town a new start, each move a quiet confession that something was not quite right. The boy changed schools, made friends and lost them, learned to adapt and to hide the parts of himself that did not fit. He was bright, quick with words and ideas, but also stubborn, resistant to authority that was not his own. Teachers saw flashes of potential but also something troubling, a refusal to submit, a belief that rules applied to others but not to him. His father wanted him to follow in his footsteps, to become a civil servant, steady and respectable. But the boy had other dreams, dreams that drifted toward beauty and creation, toward something his father could never understand. He loved to draw. Hours would vanish as his hand moved across paper, sketching landscapes and buildings, imagining worlds more grand than the one he inhabited. Art became his refuge, the place where he felt powerful and free, where no one could tell him he was wrong. In church, he was captivated not by God but by the drama of ritual, the theatricality of it all, the robes, the chanting, the way a single voice could command a room. He dreamed of being an artist, of seeing his name in galleries, of creating something that would outlive him. It was an innocent dream, the kind that flickers in the hearts of countless children who never become what they imagine. But in him, that dream would curdle into something darker when the world refused to grant it. And so the boy grew, caught between a father who demanded conformity and a mother who promised greatness, between the smallness of his towns and the vastness of his ambitions. He did not know yet what he would become. He only knew that he was meant for more than this, more than the quiet streets and ordinary lives that surrounded him. The seeds were planted, invisible and patient, waiting for the right soil, the right darkness, to finally take root. When the boy was 13, the world shifted beneath his feet in a way that could never be undone. His father, Alois, that stern and unyielding figure who had cast such a long shadow over his childhood, collapsed one morning and did not rise again. A stroke, sudden and final, and just like that the house changed. The silence that followed was different from the silence that had come before. It was softer, less rigid, but also emptier, as if something that had held the walls together had simply vanished. Clara wept quietly, her grief mingling with relief in ways she would never speak aloud, and the boy watched it all with eyes that did not yet understand what freedom felt like, only that the weight pressing down on him had suddenly lifted. Without his father's iron insistence, school became even more unbearable. The boy attended the real school in Linz, a technical school where discipline was strict and expectations were clear. But he had no interest in mathematics or science, no patience for subjects that felt cold and lifeless compared to the vivid worlds he could create with pencil and paper. He began to fail, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he lacked submission. He clashed with teachers, dismissed their authority, convinced himself that their judgment meant nothing because they could not see his true worth. His mother worried, pleaded with him to try harder, but he met her concern with assurances that everything would be fine, that he had a plan, that the future would prove them all wrong. In truth, he had no plan. He had only the dream, burning brighter now that there was no father to extinguish it. He wanted to be an artist, to attend the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, to walk among the great and the cultured and claim his place among them. Vienna was the jewel of the empire, a city where music poured from concert halls and architecture rose like poetry in stone. It was everything Linz was not: grand, alive, intoxicating. And he was certain, with the absolute conviction of youth, that it was waiting for him. But before Vienna, there was still Linz, and in Linz there was a boy named August Kubizek. They met by chance, two young men who loved music and art and felt stifled by the smallness of their world. August played the viola and dreamed of composing symphonies, and he saw in Adolf a kindred spirit, someone who understood what it meant to hunger for something greater. They became inseparable, spending hours walking the streets, attending opera performances, talking endlessly about their futures. August listened, patient and admiring, as Adolf spoke with a passion that could border on fury, describing the buildings he would design, the paintings he would create, the mark he would leave on the world. He spoke as if success were already his, as if the future were simply a matter of waiting for reality to catch up to his vision. August saw genius in his friend, but he also saw something else, a brittleness, a rage that flickered just beneath the surface whenever the world did not align with Adolf's expectations. If someone disagreed with him, he did not engage, he dismissed them as fools. If something did not go his way, it was not his fault but the fault of a system designed to hold him back. He could be charming, magnetic even, but only when he felt admired. Any challenge to his sense of superiority was met with cold fury or bitter withdrawal. August overlooked it, as friends often do, seeing only the dreamer and not the shadow that dreamer cast. In 1907, Clara fell ill. Cancer, slow and merciless, began to hollow her out from the inside. The boy who had once basked in her endless affection now watched helplessly as she faded, her strength draining day by day. He sat by her bedside, sketched her portrait, tried to hold on to her with the only tools he had. The doctor, a Jewish man named Eduard Bloch, did what he could, but medicine had its limits and death had none. Clara suffered, and her son suffered watching her, and when she finally slipped away just after Christmas, something in him broke that would never be repaired. She had been the only person who had truly believed in him, the only one who had loved him without condition. And now she was gone, and the world felt colder, harder, more hostile than it ever had before. He was 18, alone, and convinced that the only way forward was through art. Vienna called to him, a city of dreams and second chances, and he packed his belongings and his portfolio and set off, certain that greatness awaited. He did not know yet that the city would chew him up and spit him out, that rejection was waiting for him like a trap already set. He only knew that he had to go, had to prove to the ghost of his mother and the memory of his father and the doubting world that he was special, that he mattered, that he was destined for more. The boy from Braunau was leaving, and the man he would become was already stirring in the shadows, waiting to be born. Vienna rose before him like a promise carved in stone and light. The city sprawled across the Danube, grand and indifferent, its boulevards lined with Baroque palaces and concert halls where the music of Mozart and Beethoven still seemed to linger in the air. Everywhere he looked, there was beauty, columns and arches, sculptures that seemed to breathe, buildings that spoke of empires and centuries. This was the heart of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a place where culture was worshipped like a religion, and he had come to claim his place among its priests. He was 18 years old, carrying a leather portfolio filled with watercolors and architectural sketches, convinced that the Academy of Fine Arts would see what his mother had always seen, that he was exceptional, that he was meant for this. The Academy stood like a temple to art itself, imposing and elegant, its halls filled with the works of masters and the dreams of young men who believed they could join their ranks. He climbed the steps with his heart pounding, his portfolio clutched tight, rehearsing in his mind the moment when the professors would look at his work and nod with approval, when they would welcome him into their world. He had prepared for this his entire life, or so he believed. Every sketch he had made, every hour spent imagining himself as an artist, had led to this moment. Failure was not something he had considered, because failure was for others, for those without vision, without destiny. But the world does not bend to belief alone. The examiners looked at his drawings with expressions that gave nothing away, flipping through his portfolio with the detached professionalism of men who had seen 1,000 hopefuls and would see 1,000 more. And when the decision came, it arrived not with ceremony but with a simple, brutal clarity: he had not been accepted. His technical skills were insufficient, they said. His work showed some ability, but not enough, not the kind of raw talent that could be shaped into greatness. They suggested he might try architecture instead, though even that was offered without enthusiasm, more a dismissal than a direction. He stood outside the academy as the world continued around him, people passing by in their ordinary lives, unaware that his universe had just collapsed. Rejection was not something he knew how to process. It was not part of the narrative he had built for himself, not part of the story his mother had whispered to him in the dark. He told himself the examiners were wrong, that they were blind, that the system was broken and could not recognize true genius when it stood before them. But beneath the anger was something worse, a creeping doubt, a whisper that maybe, just maybe, he was not as special as he had always believed. He stayed in Vienna anyway, unable to return home in defeat, unwilling to face the questions and the pity. He rented a small room, living off the modest inheritance his mother had left him, and he tried again. 1 year passed, and he applied to the academy once more, certain that this time they would see. But they did not even let him take the entrance exam. The rejection was swifter, colder, more final. And this time, there was no comforting explanation, no gentle suggestion of another path. There was only the closed door and the weight of knowing he had been judged and found wanting, not once but twice. Vienna, which had seemed so full of promise, began to reveal its other face, the one it showed to those who did not belong. The inheritance money dwindled, slipping through his fingers in rented rooms and cheap meals, and soon he could no longer afford even the modest lodgings he had kept. He drifted downward, from room to room, each one smaller and shabbier than the last, until finally he found himself in places where desperate men slept side by side, where the smell of unwashed bodies and cheap tobacco hung in the air like a fog. He took shelter in a homeless hostel in Miedling, a bleak building where the lost and the broken gathered, and he told himself it was temporary, that this was not who he really was, that the world had simply not caught up to him yet. Days blurred into one another, each one a struggle just to survive. He sold his paintings on street corners, small watercolors of Vienna's landmarks, postcard-sized dreams for tourists who barely glanced at them. He copied images from photographs, careful and precise, but there was no soul in the work, no fire. They were competent, forgettable, the kind of thing bought on a whim and forgotten by evening. He painted the opera house, the parliament building, the churches and monuments that loomed over him like reminders of everything he was not. And with each painting sold for a few coins, with each day that passed in obscurity, the bitterness grew. The hostel in Meidling became his world, a place where men without futures gathered to wait out their days. The rooms were crowded, the air thick with the smell of damp wool and cheap soup, and at night the sound of coughing and snoring filled the darkness like a chorus of the defeated. He kept to himself mostly, clutching his few possessions close, guarding his space with the suspicious vigilance of someone who had learned that trust was a luxury he could not afford. But even in that place, among men who had nothing, he held himself apart, convinced that he was different, that his presence there was a mistake the universe would soon correct. He read voraciously, devouring newspapers and pamphlets, filling his mind with ideas that seemed to explain why the world had treated him so cruelly. Vienna was a city of contradictions, a glittering capital where wealth and poverty existed side by side, where grand palaces overlooked streets filled with beggars. It was a melting pot of cultures and languages, Germans, Czechs, Hungarians, Jews, Poles, all crowded together in an empire that was slowly tearing itself apart. And in the coffeehouses and bread lines, in the dark corners where angry men gathered to complain, he heard voices that gave shape to his resentment. They spoke of enemies within, of conspiracies and betrayals, of a pure nation being corrupted by outsiders. And he listened, hungry for explanations that did not require him to look inward, that placed the blame for his failures anywhere but on himself. The Jewish population of Vienna became a focal point for this growing rage. He had known Jewish people before, Dr. Bloch, who had cared for his mother with such tenderness, but now he began to see them differently, or rather, he began to see them through the lens of the hatred that was being offered to him like a gift. In the hostel, in the streets, he heard them blamed for everything, for unemployment, for corruption, for the dilution of German culture. And slowly, insidiously, he absorbed these ideas, letting them take root in the fertile soil of his bitterness. It was easier to believe in a conspiracy than to accept that he simply had not been good enough, easier to imagine enemies pulling strings in the shadows than to face the mundane truth of his own limitations. He found a kind of companionship with another resident of the hostel, a man named Reinhold Hanisch, who saw opportunity in the angry young artist. Hanisch became a sort of business partner, selling Adolf's paintings for a slightly better price than he could get alone, taking a cut for himself. For a time, it worked. The money was still meager, but it was enough to keep him fed, to keep him in the hostel rather than on the streets. But trust between desperate men is fragile, and eventually they quarreled over money, over accusations of cheating, and the partnership dissolved in mutual resentment. Adolf even took Hanisch to court, a penniless man suing another penniless man, and won a small, hollow victory that changed nothing. The years passed slowly, each one grinding him down a little more. He was in his early 20s now, an age when others were building careers and families, and he had nothing to show for his time on earth except a portfolio of unsold paintings and a heart full of poison. He attended political meetings, standing in the back of beer halls and smoky rooms, listening to speakers rail against the government, against the empire, against everyone who was supposedly responsible for the suffering of the German people. He did not speak at these gatherings, not yet, but he watched, and he learned. He saw how words could move a crowd, how anger could be weaponized, how a man with nothing but a voice and a grievance could make others listen. Vienna taught him many things in those bitter years, but perhaps the most dangerous lesson was this, that victimhood could be a kind of power. If he was not a failed artist but a victim of a corrupt system, if his poverty was not his fault but the result of conspiracies and injustice, then his suffering had meaning. It transformed him from a nobody into someone wronged, someone owed, someone with a righteous claim against the world. And that transformation, quiet and venomous, would stay with him forever. In 1913, he finally left Vienna, slipping across the border into Munich, Germany. He told himself it was a new beginning, but really it was just another escape, another attempt to outrun the failure that clung to him like a shadow. Munich was cleaner, more orderly, more German, and he felt more at home there in ways he could not quite articulate. He rented a small room, continued to paint his postcards, continued to drift. He was 24 years old, and his life seemed to be settling into a pattern of quiet, unremarkable obscurity. He might have remained that way forever, a footnote in history, a man who dreamed of greatness and died unknown. But then, in the summer of 1914, the world caught fire. And in that fire, he would finally find the purpose that art had never given him, the sense of belonging he had searched for all his life. War was coming, vast and terrible, and it would reshape everything, including the nameless, bitter young man who had once wanted nothing more than to paint cathedrals and be loved for it. The announcement came like thunder rolling across a summer sky, sudden and electric and impossible to ignore. Austria-Hungary had declared war on Serbia, and within days the great powers of Europe were mobilizing, ancient alliances snapping into place like the closing of a trap. Germany, France, Russia, Britain, one by one they tumbled into the abyss, and the world that had seemed so stable, so permanent, revealed itself to be built on the thinnest of foundations. In Munich, crowds gathered in the streets, not in fear but in exhilaration, waving flags and singing patriotic songs, convinced that the war would be glorious and brief, a chance for young men to prove themselves before returning home as heroes. And standing among them, swept up in the fervor, was the failed artist who had spent years drifting in obscurity, finally feeling something he had not felt since his mother died, a sense of purpose. He volunteered immediately, enlisting in the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment, desperate to be part of something larger than himself. There was a problem, of course. He was Austrian, not German, and technically should have been serving in the Austrian army. But the bureaucracy was chaos in those early days, and somehow he slipped through, or perhaps no one cared enough to check. What mattered was that he was accepted, given a uniform, handed a rifle, and told to prepare for deployment. For the first time in his life, he belonged to something. He was no longer a nobody sleeping in hostels and painting postcards. He was a soldier, part of the great German war machine, and the transformation was intoxicating. The regiment was sent to the Western Front in October of 1914, thrown into the hell that would come to be known as the First Battle of Ypres. They marched through Belgium, past villages that had been shelled into rubble, past bodies that lay twisted in the mud, and the reality of war began to show itself in ways the speeches and songs had never hinted at. But he did not flinch. If anything, the horror steadied him, gave him a clarity he had never known in peacetime. In the trenches, there was no time for doubt, no space for existential questioning. There was only survival, only the mission, only the bond between men who depended on each other to make it through the next minute, the next hour, the next frozen night. He served as a dispatch runner, carrying messages between command posts and the front lines, a job that required speed and courage and a certain disregard for one's own safety. It was dangerous work. Runners were easy targets, exposed as they sprinted across open ground while bullets whined overhead, but he was good at it. He was fast, reliable, and seemingly fearless, or perhaps just numb to the possibility of death. His comrades noticed, and his superiors noticed, and he was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class for bravery, a decoration that filled him with a pride he had never felt when holding a paintbrush. The war gave him what art never could: recognition, respect, a reason to wake up each morning. But the trenches took as much as they gave. He saw men torn apart by shrapnel, watched friends die choking on gas, their lungs dissolving as they clawed at their throats. He lived in mud and filth, surrounded by rats that grew fat on corpses, and the stench of death became so familiar it stopped registering. Winter came, brutal and unforgiving, and frostbite claimed fingers and toes, while dysentery and disease swept through the lines like invisible enemies. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas stretched into another year, and then another, and the illusion of glory crumbled into the reality of slaughter on a scale humanity had never imagined. Yet he stayed. Even when others broke, when men wept and begged to be sent home, when shell shock turned soldiers into trembling ghosts, he remained steady. Some of his fellow soldiers found it unsettling, the way he seemed almost at peace in the chaos, as if the war had given him something he had been searching for all his life. He did not drink with them, did not complain, did not talk about going home. He talked about duty, about Germany, about the righteousness of their cause. He sketched in the quiet moments, drawing the ruins and the landscapes of war, but there was no softness in these images. They were hard, angular, as cold as the world they depicted. In October of 1916, he was wounded during the Battle of the Somme, a piece of shrapnel tearing into his leg. He was evacuated to a hospital in Germany, and for the first time in 2 years, he was away from the front. The recovery was slow, the wound deep, and he spent months convalescing, watching from a distance as the war ground on without him. Germany itself felt strange, alien almost, civilians who complained about rationing, who questioned the war, who did not seem to understand the sacrifice being made in the trenches. He felt a growing contempt for them, for their softness, their lack of commitment. They had not seen what he had seen, had not lived through what he had lived through, and their doubts felt like betrayal. When he was well enough to return, he went back to the front without hesitation, back to the trenches and the mud and the endless thunder of artillery. The war had become his home in a way that no place had ever been before. In the chaos, he had found order. In the destruction, he had found meaning. And in the brotherhood of soldiers, he had found the acceptance that had eluded him in every other corner of his life. He was promoted to the rank of corporal, not because he was a natural leader, his superiors noted that he lacked the charisma to command, but because he was dependable, because he did what he was told without question, because he could be counted on when others faltered. He was awarded the Iron Cross First Class in August of 1918, a rare honor for someone of his rank, presented to him for single-handedly capturing a group of French soldiers. The medal meant everything to him, a tangible proof of his worth, something he would wear for the rest of his life as a reminder that he had mattered, that he had been recognized, that he had been brave. But even as he received the honor, the war was beginning to turn. The endless waves of American soldiers were tipping the balance, and Germany's allies were collapsing one by one. The certainty that had carried the soldiers through 4 years of hell was beginning to crack, replaced by exhaustion and a creeping sense of doom. In October of 1918, near the Belgian town of Wervik, the world went dark. A British gas attack rolled across the trenches, mustard gas that settled like an invisible fog, burning eyes and lungs and skin. He was caught in it, stumbling blind through the chaos, his eyes searing with pain, tears streaming down his face. He was evacuated to a military hospital in Pasewalk, his vision reduced to shadows and shapes, uncertain if he would ever see clearly again. And it was there, lying in a hospital bed with bandages wrapped around his eyes, that the world he had fought for came crashing down. The news arrived like a death sentence. Germany had surrendered. The Kaiser had fled. The empire was finished. There would be no victory, no triumph, no justification for the millions who had died. Sailors had mutinied in Kiel, workers were striking in the streets, and socialists and communists were declaring a new republic built on the ruins of everything he had believed in. The army he had served with such devotion was being disbanded, the soldiers sent home in shame, and the treaty being drafted would blame Germany for everything, would strip away territory and pride and dignity in one brutal stroke. He lay in that hospital bed, blind and broken, and wept with a fury that bordered on madness. It was betrayal, he told himself. Germany had not lost on the battlefield, the army had been stabbed in the back by politicians and revolutionaries, by Jews and socialists who had undermined the war effort from within. He had seen the soldiers, had lived among them, and they had been willing to fight, willing to die. The defeat was not military but political, a surrender orchestrated by enemies within who had sold out the nation for their own gain. This narrative was being whispered in the hospitals and beer halls, passed from soldier to soldier like a contagion, and he absorbed it completely because it explained everything without requiring him to accept the unbearable truth, that the sacrifice had been for nothing, that the war had been lost, that all the death and suffering had led only to humiliation. His eyesight slowly returned, though his vision would never be quite the same. But something else had changed, something far deeper than physical damage. The war had not broken him the way it had broken so many others. Instead, it had forged him, had given him a sense of mission that art and ambition never could. He had found his calling in the trenches, and now, in the aftermath of defeat, he felt that calling sharpened into something clearer, more focused. Germany had been betrayed, and someone needed to fight back. Someone needed to restore what had been lost, to avenge what had been stolen, to make the nation strong again. And in the ruins of the war, in the chaos of a defeated country, he began to believe that someone might be him. He returned to Munich in November of 1918, walking into a city that no longer resembled the place he had left. Red flags hung from buildings, revolutionary councils had seized control, and the streets were filled with angry, desperate people who did not know what came next. The world he had known was gone, replaced by uncertainty and violence and competing visions of the future. He had no job, no prospects, no plan beyond a seething resentment and a growing conviction that everything he cared about was under attack. He was 30 years old, a veteran with medals and scars and nowhere to go. But the army was not quite finished with him. In the chaos of demobilization, some soldiers were retained for special duties, and he was assigned to work for the intelligence division, tasked with monitoring the political groups that were springing up across Munich like weeds in fertile soil. His job was to attend their meetings, listen to their speeches, and report back on which ones might be dangerous to the fragile new order. It was mundane work, the kind of thing that would have felt like failure in any other time. But it placed him in the right place at the right moment, and sometimes that is all history needs, someone bitter enough, angry enough, and in exactly the right place when the door finally opens. Munich in 1919 was a city trying to hold itself together with fraying rope. The revolutionary government had been crushed by right-wing paramilitary forces, leaving behind bullet holes in building facades and bodies in the streets, and now the fragile Weimar Republic struggled to assert control over a population that trusted nothing and no one. Veterans wandered without purpose, their uniforms stripped of insignia, their pride replaced by bitterness. Inflation was beginning its slow creep toward catastrophe, and in the beer halls and meeting rooms, men gathered to shout about what had gone wrong and who was to blame. It was into this cauldron of rage and desperation that he walked one September evening, following orders to observe a small political group that called itself the German Workers' Party. The meeting was held in a dingy beer hall, the Sterneckerbrau, and when he arrived there were perhaps 24 people scattered among the tables, nursing drinks and listening with varying degrees of attention to a speaker droning on about economics and national pride. It was unremarkable, forgettable, the kind of gathering that happened 100 times a night across Germany as disillusioned men tried to make sense of their broken world. He stood in the back, taking mental notes for his report, planning to leave as soon as it was polite to do so. But then someone in the audience said something that ignited the anger always simmering just beneath his surface, a suggestion that Bavaria should break away from Germany, that the nation was finished and each region should go its own way. He could not stay silent. The words poured out of him, sharp and furious, a rebuttal delivered with such passion that the room fell quiet and turned to look at this stranger who cared so much. He spoke about German unity, about the betrayal of the surrender, about the need to fight back against those who had destroyed everything worth preserving. And when he finished, breathing hard, the founder of the party, a locksmith named Anton Drexler, approached him with something like wonder in his eyes. Drexler had been searching for someone who could speak, who could articulate the rage they all felt, and in that moment he believed he had found him. A few days later, he received a postcard inviting him to join the party. He almost dismissed it. The German Workers' Party was tiny, insignificant, one of dozens of nationalist groups competing for attention in a crowded field. But he had nowhere else to be, nothing else to do, and something about the invitation stirred him. He attended another meeting, and then another, and slowly he began to see the potential that others had missed. The party had no money, no structure, no real plan, but it had anger, and anger could be shaped into something powerful if someone knew how to wield it. He became member number 55, though the party later inflated the number to make itself seem larger. And he began to speak. At first, he spoke in small rooms to small crowds, but his words had a force that surprised even him. He had spent years as a listener, absorbing the rhetoric of politicians and agitators, studying what moved people and what left them cold. Now he discovered that he could do more than listen, he could command. His voice, which had once been used only to argue with friends or complain to strangers, became an instrument of persuasion. He spoke without notes, letting the words flow from some deep well of conviction, his hands cutting through the air, his eyes blazing with intensity. He did not reason with his audiences, he inflamed them. He told them they were victims of a conspiracy, that their suffering was not their fault, that enemies within and without had stolen their birthright. And they believed him, because they wanted to believe, because the alternative was to accept that the world was simply cruel and random and that their pain had no larger meaning. The crowds grew. From dozens to hundreds, and then to thousands. The party changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, adding "national" to emphasize pride and "socialist" to appeal to the working class, though their version of socialism had nothing to do with equality and everything to do with racial identity. He designed their banner himself, a red flag with a white circle and a black swastika, an ancient symbol twisted into something new and menacing. He organized the party's public appearances with the precision of theater, understanding instinctively that politics was spectacle, that people responded to drama and emotion far more than to policy or logic. By 1921, he had seized control of the party entirely, maneuvering his rivals aside and declaring himself the Führer, the leader, a title that brooked no challenge or debate. Drexler and the others who had founded the party found themselves sidelined, watching in dismay as the man they had invited in now owned everything they had built. But they were powerless to stop him, because he had the crowds, and in the chaos of Weimar Germany, the crowds were everything. He began to assemble the pieces that would define his movement, the brown-shirt paramilitary units called the SA, stormtroopers who fought communists in the streets and protected party rallies with violence. The elaborate rituals and symbols that turned political meetings into something closer to religious ceremonies. The relentless focus on enemies, Jews, communists, the weak politicians of the Republic, who could be blamed for every misfortune. The beer halls of Munich became his stage, and he learned to play his audience like an instrument, sensing their moods, feeding their hunger for meaning and vengeance. He spoke for hours without tiring, his voice rising and falling in waves, building to crescendos that left crowds on their feet, shouting and stamping in ecstasy. He told them that Germany had been great once and would be great again, that the humiliation of Versailles would be avenged, that the November criminals who had signed the surrender would be punished. He spoke of blood and soil, of racial purity, of a mystical connection between the German people and their land. And underneath it all, woven through every speech like a dark thread, was the hatred of Jews, no longer the casual prejudice he had absorbed in Vienna, but a centerpiece of his worldview, a conspiracy theory that explained everything and demanded everything. In November of 1923, believing the moment had come to seize power, he led an armed putsch in Munich, attempting to overthrow the Bavarian government in a coup that he was certain would spark a national revolution. He marched through the streets with 2,000 supporters, flags waving, convinced that the police and army would join them once they saw the strength of the movement. But the state did not crumble before him. Instead, police opened fire at the Feldherrnhall, and the march collapsed in blood and panic. 16 of his followers died, and he himself was arrested, his dreams of immediate power shattered in a single morning. The trial that followed should have been his end, but instead it became his resurrection. He turned the courtroom into a stage, using his testimony to deliver speeches that were reported in newspapers across Germany. He did not deny his actions, he embraced them, declaring that he was guilty only of loving Germany too much, of refusing to accept the nation's humiliation. He painted himself as a patriot persecuted by a weak government, and the judges, many of them sympathetic to nationalist causes, treated him with astonishing leniency. He was sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg prison, a fortress that felt more like a retreat than a punishment, and he would serve less than 9 months. In prison, he had time to think, time to write, time to refine the vision that had driven him from the beer halls to the barricades. He dictated a book, rambling and repetitive, filled with his theories about race and destiny and the future of Germany. He called it Mein Kampf, My Struggle, and it was part autobiography, part manifesto, part fevered prophecy. In its pages, he laid out everything he believed, everything he intended to do if given the chance. Expand Germany's territory, eliminate the Jews, establish a dictatorship, create an empire that would last 1,000 years. The book sold modestly at first, but those who read it could not say they had not been warned. He had written the blueprint for catastrophe, and he had done it in plain sight. When he was released in December of 1924, Germany had changed. The hyperinflation that had destroyed savings and starved children had been brought under control through new currency reforms. The Weimar Republic seemed to be stabilizing, the economy was recovering, and people were less desperate, less willing to listen to extremists promising revolution. His party, banned after the putsch, was a shell of what it had been, and many believed his moment had passed, that he was yesterday's news, a failed revolutionary whose time had come and gone. But he was patient in a way he had never been before. Prison had taught him that power could not be seized by force, at least not yet. It had to be won through politics, through elections, through the slow accumulation of support until the moment was right. He rebuilt the party methodically, traveling across Germany, speaking in town after town, refining his message, recruiting followers. He created a network of local organizations, a propaganda machine that churned out posters and pamphlets, a cult of personality that placed his image everywhere. He was no longer just the leader of a party, he was becoming a symbol, a savior promised to a nation that did not yet know it needed saving. The years passed slowly, the party growing but still marginal, still a fringe movement that won small percentages in elections and was dismissed by serious politicians as a passing fever. He was mocked in the press, caricatured as a clown with a ridiculous mustache and a voice that cracked when he shouted. But he kept speaking, kept organizing, kept waiting. Because he understood something that his enemies did not, that stability is fragile, that prosperity can vanish overnight, and that when people are frightened and desperate, they will turn to anyone who promises strength, who offers certainty in place of doubt, who gives them someone to blame and someone to follow. And then, in 1929, the world economy collapsed. The American stock market crashed, sending shockwaves across the globe, and Germany, still fragile from the war and dependent on American loans, was hit harder than almost anywhere else. Banks failed, businesses closed, unemployment soared into the millions. Men who had been working one day were begging on street corners the next, and the Weimar government seemed powerless to stop the slide into chaos. The moment he had been waiting for had finally arrived. The chaos he had promised to fix was here, and now, at last, people were ready to listen. The depression swept across Germany like a plague, leaving devastation in its wake that was psychological as much as economic. By 1932, 6 million Germans were unemployed, standing in bread lines that stretched around city blocks, watching their savings evaporate and their dignity crumble. The Weimar Republic, already fragile, began to fracture under the weight of competing visions and desperate solutions. Communists fought nationalists in the streets, and in the middle stood a government that seemed incapable of governing, paralyzed by indecision and internal divisions. Into this void stepped the man who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment, who had built a movement designed to thrive on chaos, who promised order through strength and redemption through ruthlessness. His rallies became spectacles of almost religious fervor. Massive crowds gathered in torchlit stadiums, flags rippling in the wind, thousands of voices chanting in unison. He would arrive late, deliberately, letting the anticipation build until it was almost unbearable, and then he would emerge, walking through the crowds like a messiah, bathed in spotlights carefully arranged to make him appear larger than life. And when he spoke, his voice carried across the masses, amplified by microphones and loudspeakers, telling them they had been chosen for greatness, that their suffering would be transformed into triumph, that Germany would rise from the ashes stronger than ever before. He did not offer policies or plans in any conventional sense, he offered emotion, identity, purpose. He offered them an enemy to hate and a future to believe in. The elections of 1930 gave his party a breakthrough, winning over 18% of the vote and becoming the second largest party in the Reichstag. 2 years later, in the elections of July 1932, they became the largest party, winning 37%. He had done it, not through revolution, but through democracy, or at least through democracy's forms. The conservatives who had dismissed him as a vulgar upstart now began to calculate whether they could use him, whether they could harness his popularity for their own ends and control him once he was brought into government. They believed they were clever, that they understood the game better than this former corporal with his crude rhetoric and thuggish followers. They were catastrophically wrong. In January of 1933, after months of backroom negotiations and political maneuvering, he was appointed Chancellor of Germany. The aged President Hindenburg, who despised him personally but saw no other option to break the political deadlock, administered the oath of office with visible reluctance. Conservative politicians congratulated themselves, certain they had contained the threat, that he would be a figurehead they could manipulate. That night, his stormtroopers marched through Berlin in triumph, their torches turning the streets into rivers of fire, and anyone watching closely could see that something irrevocable had just happened, that a door had opened which could never be closed again. He moved with shocking speed. Within weeks of taking office, he began dismantling the democratic structures that had brought him to power. A fire at the Reichstag building, blamed on communists though the truth would forever remain murky, gave him the pretext to declare a state of emergency. Civil liberties were suspended. Political opponents were arrested. The Enabling Act, passed in March with a combination of legal votes and violent intimidation, gave him the power to enact laws without parliamentary approval, effectively making him dictator. And then, systematically, every institution that might challenge him was either seized or destroyed, trade unions dissolved, opposition parties banned, the press brought under control, the courts made subservient. By the summer of 1933, less than 6 months after becoming chancellor, he had transformed Germany into a one-party state with himself as its absolute master. The country that emerged from this transformation was barely recognizable. Banners bearing the swastika hung from every building, portraits of the Führer gazed down from every wall, and the Hitler salute became mandatory in all public spaces. Books were burned in massive bonfires, thousands of volumes deemed degenerate or dangerous consumed by flames while crowds cheered. Artists, writers, scientists, anyone who did not conform or whose existence challenged the racial ideology of the regime, fled into exile or disappeared into the shadows. And the Jews, who had been scapegoated in his speeches for years, now found themselves subject to an escalating campaign of persecution that began with boycotts and dismissals and would end in places the human mind could barely comprehend. The world watched with varying degrees of alarm and indifference. Some foreign leaders found him vulgar but useful, a bulwark against communism, someone who could be negotiated with. Others recognized the danger but were constrained by their own political realities, by populations weary of war and reluctant to confront another threat. And he took their hesitation as permission, as proof that he could push further, take more, that the world was weak and his vision was destiny. He rebuilt the German military in defiance of the Versailles Treaty, remilitarized the Rhineland, and when no one stopped him, he grew bolder. In 1938, he annexed Austria, the country of his birth, marching triumphantly into Vienna while crowds cheered and threw flowers. The failed artist who had once begged on these streets returned as a conqueror, and the city that had rejected him twice now bowed before him. Months later, he demanded the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, claiming the ethnic Germans there needed protection, and at Munich, the leaders of Britain and France gave it to him, desperate to avoid war, convincing themselves that this would be enough, that appeasement would satisfy his appetite. He signed the agreement and called them fools behind their backs, knowing he would take the rest of Czechoslovakia within months, and knowing they would do nothing to stop him. But each victory fed a hunger that could never be satisfied, because what he wanted was not territory but transformation, not land but a reordering of reality itself according to his vision of racial hierarchy and German supremacy. In November of 1938, coordinated attacks swept across Germany and Austria in a night of shattered glass and burning synagogues. Kristallnacht they called it, the night of broken glass, and when morning came, 91 Jews were dead, 30,000 arrested, and the message was unmistakable: this was only the beginning. The world issued statements of concern and did nothing, and he learned once again that words without action were just noise, that he could do what he wanted and the world would adjust, would rationalize, would look away. In September of 1939, he invaded Poland, and this time the world could not look away. Britain and France, finally understanding that appeasement had failed, declared war. The Second World War had begun, and it would consume the globe in flames that made the First War seem almost quaint by comparison. His armies swept across Europe with terrifying efficiency, Poland crushed in weeks, Denmark and Norway seized, France defeated in a campaign that stunned the world. By the summer of 1940, he stood at the English Channel, master of continental Europe, and for a moment it seemed as though nothing could stop him, that his promises of a 1,000-year Reich might actually come to pass. But empires built on hatred and violence carry the seeds of their own destruction, and his was no exception. He turned east, invading the Soviet Union in June of 1941 with the largest military force ever assembled, convinced that the Slavic peoples were inferior and would collapse before German might. For months it seemed he might be right. Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed, millions of prisoners taken, cities burned. But Russia is vast and winter is merciless, and as the German advance stalled before Moscow, as soldiers froze in trenches and supply lines stretched beyond breaking, the first cracks appeared in the facade of invincibility. And behind the advancing armies, in the occupied territories, the true horror of his vision was being realized. Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, followed the Wehrmacht, systematically murdering Jews, Roma, intellectuals, anyone deemed undesirable. Mass graves filled with bodies, entire communities erased in afternoons of mechanized slaughter. But even this was not efficient enough for the vision he had articulated in Mein Kampf, for the final solution he had promised. And so the machinery of industrialized death was constructed, camps with names that would echo through history like curses, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec. Places where human beings were transported in cattle cars, sorted on arrival, and murdered in gas chambers disguised as showers, their bodies burned in crematoria that ran day and night, the smoke visible for miles. 6 million Jews were murdered, along with millions of others, Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, Soviet POWs, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, anyone who did not fit the twisted vision of racial purity. It was genocide on a scale that defied comprehension, organized with bureaucratic precision, carried out by ordinary men who convinced themselves they were following orders, serving a higher purpose. And at the center of it all was the failed artist who had once wanted to paint cathedrals, now presiding over the greatest crime in human history, his name forever synonymous with evil. By 1943, the war had turned. The Soviets had held at Stalingrad, grinding the German Sixth Army into annihilation in brutal street fighting that lasted months. The Americans had entered the war after Pearl Harbor, bringing industrial might that Germany could never match. Allied bombers turned German cities into infernos, and on every front, the armies that had seemed invincible were being pushed back. He refused to accept reality, issued orders for non-existent divisions to counterattack, blamed his generals for failures that were his own. He retreated deeper into fantasy, into medication and rage, even as the Reich he had promised would last 1,000 years crumbled around him. In July of 1944, his own officers tried to kill him, planting a bomb in his headquarters that exploded but left him alive, his ears ringing and his arm injured but his conviction unshaken. He took vengeance with savage thoroughness, executing thousands in the aftermath, anyone suspected of disloyalty hanged on meat hooks or strangled slowly with piano wire. But the assassination attempt had revealed the truth, even those closest to him knew the war was lost, that continuing meant only more death and destruction. He did not care. If Germany could not win, he declared, then Germany deserved to be destroyed, and he issued orders for a scorched earth policy, for infrastructure to be demolished and cities left in ruins. The final months were a descent into madness and despair. The Allies crossed into Germany from the west, the Soviets stormed in from the east, and the nation that had conquered a continent found itself squeezed between two advancing armies that would accept nothing less than unconditional surrender. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble, their streets filled with refugees fleeing the advancing Red Army, knowing what vengeance awaited those who had brought such suffering to Soviet soil. He remained in Berlin, refusing to flee, retreating into an underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery as the city above him was torn apart by artillery and bombs. The bunker became his tomb long before his body died. 50 feet below ground, sealed behind concrete and steel, he existed in a twilight world lit by electric bulbs, breathing recycled air while outside the city burned. His closest followers huddled around him, some still believing in miracle weapons that would turn the tide, others simply too afraid or too complicit to abandon him. He held meetings with generals who commanded armies that no longer existed, moved pins on maps representing divisions that had been destroyed weeks earlier, and raged against the betrayals he imagined on all sides. His hands trembled uncontrollably, possibly from Parkinson's disease, possibly from the cocktail of drugs his personal physician injected into him daily. His face was gray, his eyes vacant between moments of manic intensity, and the man who had once commanded millions with his voice now spoke to a handful of sycophants in an underground grave. Above him, Berlin was dying. Soviet artillery pounded the city day and night, reducing entire neighborhoods to smoking ruins. German soldiers, many of them boys barely old enough to shave, fought with desperate courage or terror, knowing that surrender meant uncertain fate at Soviet hands. Civilians cowered in basements and subway tunnels, drinking contaminated water, eating whatever could be found, waiting for the end that everyone knew was coming. The smell of death hung over everything, bodies in the streets, corpses buried in rubble, the smoke from countless fires. On April 20, 1945, his 56th birthday, a handful of loyalists gathered in the bunker to offer congratulations that must have felt like mockery. Soviet forces were less than a mile from the chancellery, their artillery so close that the walls shook with each impact. He made one final trip to the surface, emerging into daylight to inspect a group of Hitler Youth defenders, children given rifles and told to hold back an army. He moved along the line, patting cheeks and distributing iron crosses to boys who would be dead within days, perhaps hours. Then he descended back into the earth and would never see the sky again. Eva Braun was with him, the woman who had loved him with a devotion he had never quite returned, who had tried to kill herself twice when he neglected her but who now, at the end, refused to leave his side. In the early hours of April 29, with Soviet soldiers fighting block by block toward the chancellery, he married her in a brief civil ceremony. It was a gesture that would have been absurd if it were not so desperately sad, a wedding in a bunker while the world they had known collapsed overhead, two people joining their lives together with perhaps days or hours remaining. That same day, he learned that his former ally Benito Mussolini had been captured by Italian partisans, executed, and hung upside down in a public square in Milan, his body subjected to the rage of crowds who spat on it and struck it. The image haunted him, the humiliation, the desecration, the final powerlessness. He gave explicit instructions that his body was to be burned after his death, that nothing was to remain for his enemies to parade or defile. He would not end as Mussolini had, would not give the world that satisfaction. On April 30, as Soviet forces closed the final distance to the bunker, he said his goodbyes to the staff who remained. He shook hands with his secretaries, his adjutants, the few soldiers still maintaining the pretense of defense. Then he retreated to his private quarters with Eva. The details of what happened next would be reconstructed from testimony of those who remained, from the evidence found afterward. A single gunshot, muffled by concrete and earth. When his valet and aides entered, they found two bodies. Eva had taken cyanide, and he had shot himself through the head with his service pistol. The man who had started a war that killed over 70 million people, who had ordered the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, who had brought destruction on a scale that beggared imagination, had ended his own life rather than face the consequences of what he had done. His body was carried up into the garden of the Reich Chancellery, wrapped in a blanket. Gasoline was poured over him and Eva, and they were set alight while Soviet shells continued to fall around them. The cremation was incomplete, hasty, interrupted by artillery fire. Later, Soviet forces would find the charred remains, and for decades the fate of his body would remain officially uncertain, though Soviet archives eventually revealed they had recovered what was left, kept it in secret storage, and finally destroyed it completely in 1970, scattering the ashes so that no grave could ever become a shrine. Berlin fell within days of his death, and a week later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over, but the world it left behind was transformed beyond recognition. Cities across the continent lay in ruins, monuments reduced to rubble, entire populations displaced. The death toll would take years to fully count, over 70 million dead, including 27 million Soviets, 6 million Poles, hundreds of thousands from every nation that had been touched by the conflict. Soldiers and civilians, combatants and innocents, whole families erased, entire communities that would never be rebuilt. But beyond the military casualties, beyond even the staggering destruction of cities and infrastructure, was the discovery of something that broke through the numbness that years of war had created. As Allied forces advanced into Germany and Poland, they began to find the camps. Soldiers who had seen every kind of horror that war could produce found themselves unprepared for what awaited them behind the barbed wire and guard towers. Mountains of emaciated corpses, mass graves filled with thousands of bodies, gas chambers disguised as showers, crematoria with human ash still in them, warehouses filled with the belongings of the murdered, shoes and eyeglasses and suitcases, each one representing a life ended, a person who had been loved, who had hoped and feared and dreamed. The survivors who remained were barely recognizable as human beings, skeletal figures with hollow eyes who could not believe that liberation had finally come, that the nightmare was ending. Some were so weak they died within days of being freed, their bodies too damaged to recover. Others would carry the physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives, unable to speak of what they had endured, unable to forget. The world saw the photographs and newsreels and could not look away, could not deny, could not minimize. This was what his vision had created, this was where hatred and ideology had led, to factories of death, to the mechanized murder of millions, to a crime so vast that a new word had to be invented to describe it, genocide. In the months and years that followed, the Allies worked to document what had happened, to hold trials for those who had survived and carried responsibility. At Nuremberg, in the same city where he had once held his massive rallies, the remaining leaders of the Nazi regime sat in the dock and faced judgment. Some offered defenses that ranged from denial to claims they were merely following orders. Some showed remorse, though whether it was genuine or performed was impossible to know. Others remained defiant to the end, unrepentant, still believing in the ideology that had brought them to this moment. 24 were indicted, 12 were sentenced to death, and the trials established precedents about individual responsibility and crimes against humanity that would echo through international law for generations. But the man at the center of it all, the architect of the entire catastrophe, escaped human judgment. He had chosen his own end, in his own time, in the bunker beneath the city he had promised to rebuild as the capital of a 1,000-year empire. There would be no reckoning for him, no moment in the dock where he would have to answer for what he had done, no opportunity for his victims to face him and demand an explanation that could never be sufficient. He had slipped away into death leaving only questions and ashes, and the world was left to make sense of how one human being could have caused such unimaginable suffering. In the decades that followed, historians and psychologists would study him endlessly, searching for explanations, trying to understand how a failed artist from Austria had risen to command a nation and nearly conquered a continent. They would analyze his childhood traumas, his rejection from art school, his experience in the trenches, the historical circumstances that created the conditions for his rise. They would debate whether he was insane or calculating, whether he believed his own propaganda or cynically manipulated others, whether his hatred was ideological or pathological. But all their analysis could never quite capture the enormity of what had happened, could never fully explain how someone who began life as a child with dreams like any other had become the embodiment of evil itself. The places he touched would bear scars for generations. Germany would be divided for nearly half a century, its cities rebuilt from rubble, its people carrying the weight of collective guilt and responsibility. The Jewish communities of Europe that had flourished for centuries were decimated, their culture and traditions nearly erased, and survivors scattered across the world carrying trauma that would pass to their children and grandchildren. The political map was redrawn, borders shifted, entire populations moved, and the Cold War that emerged from the ashes of the Second World War would define global politics for the next 50 years. His name became shorthand for absolute evil, the standard against which all other atrocities would be measured. To compare someone to him became the ultimate condemnation, and yet the comparison was made so often it risked becoming cheapened, losing its weight through overuse. His image became iconic in the worst possible way, the mustache, the salute, the ranting speeches, reduced to caricature but never losing their power to disturb, to remind the world of what humanity was capable of when hatred was given power and conscience was abandoned. The warning signs had been there from the beginning, visible to anyone willing to look. He had written his intentions in Mein Kampf, had spoken them openly in speeches, had demonstrated his willingness to use violence and disregard all moral boundaries in his rise to power. And yet he had been dismissed, appeased, underestimated, enabled by those who thought they could control him or who chose not to see what he truly was until it was far too late. The lesson, if there was one, was not just about the danger of hatred and authoritarianism, but about the human capacity for denial, for rationalization, for convincing ourselves that the unthinkable cannot happen until we are living inside it. The night deepens now, and we come to the final truth of this story, the lesson that lingers long after the facts have been recited and the history has been told. His life was a tragedy, but not in the way that term is usually meant. It was not tragic because he suffered some noble flaw or fell from grace through circumstance beyond his control. It was tragic because it was preventable, because at every turn there were moments when a different choice could have led to a different outcome, because the seeds of what he became were planted in soil that could have grown something else entirely. The boy in Braunau who loved to draw was not born a monster. He was born into a world that was cruel to him in small ways and kind to him in others, and he made choices about which experiences to hold on to and which to release. He chose resentment over forgiveness, chose to see rejection as conspiracy rather than as the ordinary disappointments that every life contains. He chose to believe that his failures were never his own, that the world owed him recognition, that his suffering gave him the right to inflict suffering on others. And with each choice, the path narrowed, the possibilities diminished, until the boy who had wanted to paint cathedrals became the man who built death camps instead. There is a temptation, when studying such a life, to search for the moment when he crossed a line from which there could be no return, the decisive instant when he became irredeemable. But history does not work that way. There was no single moment, no dramatic transformation. There was only the slow accumulation of hatred, the gradual hardening of heart, the steady progression from bitterness to rage to genocidal fury. Each step led to the next, each rationalization made the next one easier, until he had walked so far into darkness that the light behind him was no longer visible. And that is perhaps the most haunting aspect of his story, that he was not unique, not some aberration that could never be repeated. He was a human being, with human emotions and human weaknesses, who made choices that millions of other human beings have made in smaller ways throughout history. The choice to blame others for our pain, to dehumanize those who are different, to believe that violence can solve problems that patience and compassion cannot. The infrastructure of hatred he built, the propaganda, the scapegoating, the appeals to tribal identity and fear, these are tools that have been used before and since, in different places and different contexts, by people who convince themselves they are doing what must be done. The 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust were not abstractions or statistics. They were teachers and merchants, children and grandparents, musicians and tailors, people with names and faces and dreams that will never be realized. They were families torn apart, communities erased, futures that will never exist. And they died not because of some inevitable force of nature, but because human beings decided to kill them, because a society was convinced that they were less than human, because enough people participated or looked away or convinced themselves it was not their responsibility to intervene. In the decades since his death, the world has grappled with how to remember what happened, how to ensure it never happens again. Museums and memorials have been built, testimonies recorded, education programs created to teach new generations about the Holocaust and the war. Never again became a rallying cry, a promise made by those who witnessed the horror that humanity would learn from this darkest chapter and build something better. Yet genocide has happened again, in Cambodia, in Rwanda, in Bosnia, in Sudan, each time with different justifications but the same fundamental denial of human dignity, the same willingness to see other people as obstacles to be eliminated rather than as fellow beings worthy of life. The uncomfortable truth is that the capacity for what he did lives in all of us, not as destiny but as possibility. We all carry within us the ability to hate, to dehumanize, to rationalize cruelty when we believe we have been wronged or when we are afraid. The difference between being complicit in evil and standing against it is not some innate moral superiority, but the choices we make when those impulses arise, the willingness to see clearly even when clarity is painful, the courage to act even when action carries a cost. His life reminds us that evil does not announce itself with horns and a pitchfork. It arrives wearing the mask of patriotism, speaking the language of grievance and restoration, promising to make things as they were before, to make us great again, to protect us from enemies who are the source of all our problems. It appeals to our worst instincts while telling us we are justified, even righteous, in following them. And it gains power not through supernatural force but through the ordinary mechanisms of human society, elections and laws, bureaucracies and institutions, the cooperation or silence of people who tell themselves they are just doing their jobs, just following orders, just trying to survive. The question his life poses to us, across the decades, is not how could one man have done such terrible things, but how did so many others allow him to do them? How did a nation of educated, cultured people embrace an ideology of hatred? How did neighbors turn on neighbors? How did ordinary men become executioners? How did a society convince itself that industrial murder was not just acceptable but necessary? The answer is neither simple nor comforting. It involved propaganda and pressure, fear and ambition, the erosion of truth and the normalization of violence, the exploitation of genuine grievances and the manufacture of false ones. It involved people making small compromises that led to larger ones, people looking away because confronting reality was too difficult, people participating because they believed they had no choice or because, deep down, they agreed. And so we come to the end of this story, here in the quiet darkness where sleep beckons and the world feels distant. The life we have traced tonight, from the boy in Braunau to the corpse in the bunker, is not just history. It is a warning etched in blood and ash, a reminder that civilization is fragile, that the progress we take for granted can be undone, that the unthinkable can become reality if we are not vigilant. His name will live forever, but not as he imagined, not as a great leader or visionary, but as a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when hatred is given power and conscience is abandoned. The victims of his hatred deserve to be remembered not as anonymous numbers but as individuals who lived and loved and hoped, whose absence diminishes us all. And the lesson of his life is not that evil is invincible, for it was defeated, but that it must be confronted, that silence and appeasement only feed it, that standing against it requires courage but is the only path that leads anywhere worth going. Let the night hold these truths gently as you drift toward sleep. Let the weight of history settle softly rather than crushing, a reminder of what we must guard against but also of our capacity to choose differently, to build instead of destroy, to love instead of hate. The tragedy of his life is complete, but the story of humanity continues, and each of us writes our small part of it with every choice we make, every time we decide whether to speak or stay silent, to stand or step aside, to see others as human or as something less. Rest now, knowing that the darkness we have walked through tonight is past, that the morning will come as it always does, bringing with it the possibility of making a better world than the one he left behind. His name is a scar on history, but scars remind us of wounds that have healed, of pain that was survived, of the resilience that allows us to continue even after the worst humanity can inflict. Sleep softly, and may your dreams be free from the shadows we have explored together. The story is finished, the night welcomes you home, and tomorrow waits with all its quiet promise of redemption.